Israel announced victory after 12 days of fighting. However, many doubt the truthfulness of these claims. Behind the explosions and propaganda, the victory conceals a much more bitter and impossible-to-hide reality. The country is now forced to confront colossal losses that undermine the foundations of its economy and defense, which until now were a source of admiration. Iran's attacks had devastating consequences for Israel. Civilian infrastructure has been destroyed. The defense system, so highly praised, failed to provide the expected protection, and the country's economy is severely shaken. What was considered Israel's greatest strength proved to be very fragile in the face of a massive attack. Israel's air defense system, the Iron Dome, considered one of the most advanced and reliable, proved incapable of withstanding massive strikes. Iranian drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles arrived simultaneously, forcing Israel's air defense system into a tough battle. However, the result was far from what was expected. Hundreds of missiles breached their defense system. Reports indicate that around 243 Iranian missiles were not intercepted, a rather striking figure. Why were these missiles not intercepted? Not because Israel showed mercy, but because they knew that if Iran launched all its missiles simultaneously and targeted densely populated areas, their defense could completely collapse. In this bitter reality, the Iron Dome, which until now was a symbol of Israel's protection, proved unable to protect its major cities. These airstrikes opened the world's eyes to the fact that no air defense system can guarantee complete protection in such a situation. The attacks occurred not only in the air, but also across Israel's entire infrastructure. From north to east, Iranian strikes mercilessly hit almost the entire territory of the country. Hundreds of buildings were destroyed, including in Tel Aviv, Ramat, and many other places. This destruction adds to a long list of damages that continue to affect various sectors. Despite the Israeli government's strict censorship and attempts to conceal the extent of the destruction, leaked photos and videos reveal a much more terrifying picture. One of the largest attacks targeted the Kiryat complex, known as Israel's Pentagon. Despite being protected by a modern defense system, Iran's missiles penetrated it. Additionally, Israel's main intelligence centers were attacked. Buildings considered strongholds of the country's defense, including the Mossad buildings, were completely destroyed. This attack not only demolished structures, but also struck at the heart of Israel's intelligence system, which ensured the country's security. On June 15, an Iranian missile strike targeted Israel's most prestigious research center, the Weizmann Institute, resulting in the destruction of 45 laboratories and scientific projects funded by the European Union. Years of data and hopes for the future tied to these projects vanished in an instant. Beyond the attacks on research facilities, Israel's energy sector was paralyzed. The largest oil refinery in Haifa was hit by a missile strike, forcing it to temporarily close. This attack disrupted energy supplies for the domestic market and exports, triggering an energy crisis that further worsened Israel's economic situation. Ben Gurion International Airport, Israel's main gateway, was also not spared from the attacks. During the missile barrage, the airport was forced to shut down completely, intensifying the tension and sense of isolation within the country. The absence of incoming and outgoing flights cut Israel off from the outside world. However, the damage from these attacks was not only physical. The population's trust in the Israeli government began to waver. The sense of security they had felt until now vanished suddenly, replaced by fear and doubts about the government's ability to protect them. Despite the Israeli government's attempts to hide the scale of the damage, reports from abroad and leaked photos increasingly show that the destruction is far greater than announced. Severe damage to military bases, the Israeli Army, IDF, command centers, radar systems, and communications indicate that Israel's defense was completely overwhelmed by Iran. These reports increasingly show that Israel not only lost the war on the battlefield, but also in terms of economic sustainability. Rising military expenditures are beginning to weigh heavily on the state budget. The total losses from the attack are estimated at over $1.76 billion, and this figure could easily increase if the conflict continues. Israel is now facing an unprecedented economic crisis. The state budget has only $2.6 billion allocated for recovery, while the war's damage could reach much higher figures. Rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure will require enormous time and resources. Beyond material losses, these attacks left a deep social impact. 28 people died, over 3,000 were injured, and around 9,000 were forced to abandon their homes. However, the greatest damage was inflicted on the shattered economy and the uncertainty gripping society. The total cost of the war that Israel will have to pay could reach $12 billion, and if tensions escalate further, it could be even higher. This figure is equivalent to the annual revenue of large countries like Nigeria. The consequences immediately reflected on Israel's economy, which is in a difficult situation and facing enormous financial challenges. In an attempt to overcome the crisis, Israel now relies on financial aid from the United States. The country hopes that with financial support, it can improve its economic situation and meet the increasingly urgent defense needs. However, despite the worsening situation in Israel, there is still hope for peace. Diplomacy and economic cooperation with Middle Eastern countries, previously deemed impossible, are now Israel's only way out of this economic abyss. The destruction Israel is experiencing has exposed many vulnerabilities in the country's defense system, which until now was considered the most advanced. The Iron Dome, Israel's pride in protecting its territory from air attacks, proved not fully effective against large-scale strikes by Iran. Multidimensional attacks, carried out simultaneously from air, sea, and land, force Israel to rely on a defense system that has already proven incapable of fully protecting the country. Israel's decision to refrain from launching all its missiles also reflects its inability to counter such massive attacks. These attacks not only demonstrated the weakness of the defense, but also shattered Israel's image as a country with the world's best defense system. The myth of the Iron Dome's invincibility began to crumble, and the world now sees that even a country with the best defense can be defeated if the attack is massive. Meanwhile, the damage inflicted on Israel's civilian infrastructure also shows how vulnerable the country is to missile strikes. Thousands of buildings, including homes, offices, and public facilities, were severely damaged. Many people were left homeless, and rebuilding a large number of destroyed buildings will take years. This demonstrates the heavy burden Israel will have to bear in the post-war recovery process. The destruction in the energy sector also had enormous consequences for Israel. The Haifa oil refinery, one of the country's main energy suppliers, was forced to close temporarily, disrupting domestic energy supply and exports. Additionally, production at the Leviathan gas field was halted, affecting the production of energy essential for the country's livelihood. Under these conditions, Israel is now facing an energy crisis that could further worsen the situation. Power outages affect all areas of life, from industry and transportation to the domestic sector. Israel's dependence on external energy sources further highlighted its vulnerability in wartime. For Israeli society, the social consequences of these attacks are particularly tangible. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to abandon their homes, leaving behind everything they owned. The trauma of such massive and intense attacks will leave a lasting mark. The population's trust in the government is also declining, given its failure to protect them from such sudden and large-scale attacks. For refugees, an uncertain future further exacerbates the psychological and emotional burden. Those forced to leave their homes and properties must struggle to survive in conditions of uncertainty. On the other hand, survivors of the attacks also face enormous material losses while still hoping for government assistance and recovery. Israel is also facing increasingly serious financial pressure. Due to rising reconstruction costs and ongoing losses, Israel is forced to seek external funding sources for the country's reconstruction. Aid from friendly countries, primarily the United States, is of great importance for recovery. However, amidst a worsening economic situation, Israel may face difficulties in obtaining this aid. In addition to financial problems, Israel must also deal with growing debt, which continues to increase due to the war. Many civilian projects have been forced to be postponed, and the state budget is increasingly constrained to finance other urgent needs. The reduction of social payments has also become one of the direct consequences of the crisis, affecting the lives of the population impacted by the war. The economic crisis Israel is facing requires swift and long-term solutions. One of the paths currently being explored is diplomacy and economic cooperation with neighboring Middle Eastern countries. However, this is a significant challenge, given the ongoing tension in the region. If peace efforts fail, Israel risks facing an even more severe economic collapse. Moreover, International attention to Israel's situation is also growing. The world now better understands that the destruction Israel is experiencing is not just an event affecting one country, but has broader implications for geopolitical stability in the Middle East. The conflict, initially considered an internal issue, now has global repercussions, affecting the economy and politics of many countries. However, while the crisis in Israel is quite serious, it cannot be denied that the situation in Gaza is far worse. While Israel suffers significant losses, the situation in Gaza is much more tragic, with a higher number of casualties and far more significant destruction. This irony exacerbates the complexity of the prolonged conflict, and it seems there is no short-term solution that could resolve it.